Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, we are gathered here to celebrate the legacy of a remarkable man who in the short span of half a century had a profound impact on the culture of his people, the history of his region, and the literature of his language. He helped forge the modern identity of the Arabs, founded the modern mass media there, and brought culture to the broad public as he pioneered the use of the novel in Arabic. He was a man of letters who understood and publicized science, a man of the Christian faith who had a profound knowledge of Islam and the history of the Muslim peoples, and helped bring that history to life for generations of Muslims, including myself. It is a remarkable legacy. And it is most appropriate that we should be celebrating this 150th anniversary of his birth and the 120th anniversary of the founding of his publishing enterprise, the Dar al-Hilal, right here in the Library of Congress, the greatest library institution in the world. I have no doubt that the brilliant group of specialists gathered on this occasion will contribute much to our understanding of Zaidan and his legacy. However, let me, in this brief opening address, present a number of points that I hope you will find of interest. Let me start with a brief overview of Zaidan and his times, called the period of Al-Nahda, or the Arab Renaissance, or the Arab Awakening, to use the title coined by George Antonius in his 1938 book of that title. Georgi Zaidan, I submit, was one of the artisans of that societal prise de conscience. Like an unchecked cancer, bad governance had turned the once mighty Ottoman Empire into the sick man of Europe. Ottoman ossification had brought the Arab and Muslim worlds to a new low. The jolt of reawakening was to come in the form of the French invasion of Egypt in 1798. After the French defeat and withdrawal, chaos reigned under the nominal suzerainty of the Ottomans until Muhammad Ali took the reins of power in Egypt and started his ambitious development and modernization programs. Though set back by the West in 1840, the momentum of reform was to continue. And by the second half of the 19th century, a true movement to modernize Egypt was underway. It was into that world of transformation and transition that Zaidan would flourish. He was to make a signal contribution to this Arab Renaissance, the Nahda. Indeed, he is considered by some, like Philip, to have been the archetypical member of the Arab Nahda at the end of the 19th century. Now, two strands come together in this Nahda, or this transformation. One is admiration for European achievements that promotes emulation of the West, and the other, an insistence on reviving the roots of the culture of the East. Each of these two strands, in turn, has two identifiable strands. In looking to the West, there is a desire to fully emulate it in terms of technology, modernity, and much more. But a resistance to full Westernization in terms of refusing to promote values that would undermine our own cultural roots and nascent national identity. And again, when it comes to reviving the Eastern identity and cultural roots, two strands can be identified. Those who wanted a pan-Islamic revival, as championed by Afghani, Abdu, and Rida, and those who wanted an Arab revival, as championed by Al-Kawakibi. It was part of the genius of Georgi Zaidan that he epitomized the weaving together of these four strands, as few have been able to do it before or since. In so doing, he responded to a deep latent desire among Arab and Muslim intellectuals and reformers. But Zaidan was much more than a contributor to the intellectual debates of his time. He transformed society by helping build the Arab media, the key instrument to educate the public in those days. And he was an important literary figure as well, a pioneer of the novel and a historian of Islamic civilization. So let's discuss the four facets of Georgi Zaidan. Zaidan, the builder of the Arab press. Zaidan, the intellectual activist. Zaidan, the literary author. And Zaidan, the man. Then I would like to conclude with a few comments about why I think that Georgi Zaidan and his thinking are both pertinent and relevant for our times, the times of the Arab Spring. So let me start with Zaidan, the builder of the Arab press. We all know that the printing press, and especially the journal and the newspaper, were the major instruments for public debates in the 19th century. Every single member of the Nahda was a writer, a publisher, an editor, and or owner of newspapers and journals. Al-Hilal, created by Zaidan, with Al-Muqtataf, Al-Manar, became the highest intellectual authorities within the Nahda movement. But Zaidan, the self-made man, achieved what none of his contemporaries was able to do. He created a lasting institution. This was the unique strength of Zaidan, that far from simply creating something that he dominated, and dominated he did, he successfully institutionalized Al-Hilal so that it survived him by a century and is today the oldest continuously publishing cultural journal in the Arab world. He is rightly considered to have been one of a handful of individuals who created modern Arab journalism. But Zaidan's commitment was to educate the public, not just to produce a literary magazine as a vanity project for himself. Indeed, his foreword to the first issue of Al-Hilal crystallizes his commitment to educating society in a liberal, pluralistic fashion which he considers a duty. Georgi Zaidan was the founder, writer, editor-in-chief, manager, and printer of Al-Hilal magazine. He turned it into a platform for the works of distinguished authors, pioneers of Arabic literature, including giants like Hussein Haikal, Taha Hussein, Muhammad Farid Wagdi, Ali Garim, Abbas Mahmoud al-Aqad, Mustafa Lutfi al-Manfaluti, and Ahmad Amin. And because of that, Al-Hilal achieved great fame and survived his death and became a towering institution of journalism. To stay in circulation also required navigating the shoals of political censorship of his day. Confronting Western occupation in the Middle East and North Africa was no easy feat, but Zaidan managed it with a delicate balance between cultural and political activism. Another major contribution of Georgi Zaidan was to expand the scope of culture beyond literature to include history, philosophy, science, sociology, politics, and economics, thus merging intellectual thought with art and science with philosophy. For Zaidan believed in the importance of education for all of society, in the broadest sense of education. Now let me turn to Zaidan as a thinker. For beyond Zaidan the journalist, the media mogul, and the editor, is Zaidan the intellectual. His views on many topics were influential with his contemporaries and for subsequent generations. What can we say about the thinking of this self-made man? While it was undoubtedly multifaceted, I will try to limit my remarks to a few of the many areas where he made important contributions. Specifically, let me address his attitudes towards science, towards Arab and Muslim culture, towards political reform, and towards the status of women. First, he had a profound belief in rationality and science. Indeed, He had defended the right to teach evolution when Darwin was still unacceptable to the Christian Church. He believed that the scientific approach was the key to education more generally. And this carried over into his work as a journalist, where we note that Zaidan, who had been exposed to an education in medicine, chemistry, mathematics, and pharmacology, wrote about many scientific issues such as radium, Röntgen's X-rays, tuberculosis, and limestone. His commitment to science and getting the facts right, noted by Al-Tamawi and Philip among many, meant that he also wanted to apply this approach to understanding one's own culture. So how did that approach reflect itself in his writings on culture? As I said at the outset, he was able to weave together the four strands of Westernization and cultural authenticity, as well as Arabism and Islam. I would say that Zaidan was able to make a profound commitment to the notion of Arabism, as distinct from relating exclusively to Egyptians or Phoenicians, even though he recognized the contribution of these different cultural strands. It was the common language of Arabic that established that a true bond existed between Arabs. But with Arab culture, he saw the influence of Islamic civilization as a major factor, giving Arab culture a content and depth beyond its own linguistic reach, and contributing to the formation of the Arab identity. And though he shunned political activism, he was nonetheless concerned with Arab history and wrote openly of an Arab nation. Now, others were seeking to revive a pan-Islamic project, but Zaidan remained true to his Arab cultural project, even though he did more than any other to link it with the content of Islamic civilization. And his masterwork on Islamic civilization would be the pioneer project that would pave the way for later authors such as Ahmad Amin. But that didn't mean that he was not involved with political reform. Now, the Ottoman Empire could no longer provide a viable model for those who saw power and modernity embodied in the West with its nationalism and imperialist tendencies. And yet that old Muslim empire had been capable of accommodating a plethora of local identities, precisely because the Muslim faith was embracing so vast a territory with so many cultures and subcultures and so many ethnicities and religious minorities. The Majlis al-Milli provided some sort of recognition and even some channels of communication to the Sublime Porte and to the centralized decision-making structure where there was a need for it. But local affairs were largely dealt with locally. So some were intent on reforming the Ottoman pan-Islamic project. And intellectuals from Afghani to Muhammad Abdu to Rashid Rida provided the intellectual framework for such political endeavors. But if Zaidan differed with these and others on the pan-Islamic versus the Arab dimension of his cultural project, he shared with many his belief that education of the public would be the key to modernizing the backward Eastern societies. And it was not a call for violent revolution or political upheaval that these enlightened men sought. Indeed, both Georgi Zaidan and Rashid Rida believed in education, but feared sudden and extreme social change. They wanted a revolution without a revolution. Liberty was a state of mind. Now, towards the end of his life, Georgi Zaidan added to his interests reflections on what made a society distinctive and what made power legitimate. But he remained overall committed to his great cultural project and did not succumb to the siren song of participating in political power. And when we talk of political reform, it immediately brings into focus the issue of the status of women. While Zaidan undoubtedly believed in the education of women, he still shows a certain wariness towards the full emancipation of women. Indeed, he writes with wistfulness about the more timid and tame Oriental women of his time compared to the brazenness which he was witnessing in Paris. His views on the status of women were more conservative than those of some of his contemporaries, such as Qasim Amin. In fact, Rashid al-Anani further notes that as conservatism regarding female emancipation tends to be habitually associated with Islam, we will do well to remember that Georgi Zaidan was a Christian. So where does all this leave us? On the whole, this prismatic author and publisher, historian and public educator, made a major contribution to the culture of the Arab Renaissance, the Nahda. As one of his successors, Muhammad Farid Wagdi, said, "If I were to count the unique personalities that have appeared in the Middle East in the last 50 years, those who have enriched it with their writings and ideas, I find myself obliged to put Georgi Zaidan at the forefront." Now, Georgi Zaidan's instrument was the pen. He was a writer. He pioneered the use of the historical novel and indirectly the novel in general as a genre of Arabic literature. His 22 novels were popular and enjoy until today an unbroken popularity. If he was not of a literary stature to compare with later figures like Taha Hussein, Abbas al-Aqad, or Naguib Mahfouz, he was the precursor and pioneer who revolutionized the Arab novel and paved the way for them. And as Albert Hourani noted, novels and the historic novels of Zaidan in particular were central to creating an Arab national consciousness. In fact, they were central to that task of raising public awareness. Zaidan's novels had certain characteristics that set them apart, as attention to historical context is pronounced, much more so than the treatment of character and plot, usually a love story with a happy ending. Now, these distinctive characteristics of his approach, as contrasted to Western novelists of the time, as well as those that followed him in the Arab world, enable us to appreciate his political and cultural purpose, not just his literary achievement. The Zaidan project was a great success. He succeeded in promoting historical knowledge among the non-intellectual elite, and thus provide a broad grounding for a common Arab identity. No less an authority than Albert Hourani remarks that perhaps it was Georgi Zaidan who did more than any other to create a consciousness of the Arab past by his histories, and still more by his series of historical novels. As to style, no less a stylist than Manfaluti admired his pellucid prose. Zaidan remains a towering figure in the history of modern Arab literature. His legacy endures. It has stood the test of time. But what about Zaidan the man? He was a man of dedication and rectitude, well represented by his grandson here among us, a self-made man and largely a self-taught intellectual of encyclopedic breadth. Georgi Zaidan was a man whom everybody loved. But I leave the personal aspects to others. I do share with Emil Amin this beautiful summary statement. We can summarize his life by saying that this man, Christian by religion, Islamic by culture, has succeeded through his fiction to introduce Islamic history with ease and lucidity, highlighting the aspects of tolerance and rationalism in it, represented a bridge for positive connection between East and West. How true. But what about the Arab Spring of today? Zaidan died before the 1919 revolution and the liberal age between the wars up to 1952 in Egypt. His thinking and contributions had a profound impact on that period. And today, following the totalitarian systems that ruled the Arab world for the second half of the 20th century, we are witnessing the Arab Spring. Is Zaidan's thinking still relevant for a democratic Arab society today, or is it only of historical interest for a few scholars? Can the Nahda, as the liberal and national base for Arab thought and politics, serve as an inspiration for the unfolding events set in motion by the revolutionary waves of the Arab Spring in 2011? Is it a viable alternative to fundamentalist tendencies? Well, today, the polarization in our countries, the Arab and Muslim countries, generally is between those who seek the revival of Muslim culture while others choose to follow the path of Western-style political liberalism and pluralistic democracy. Both parties imagine that there is no meeting ground possible. But that is not true. From its antecedents in the modernization efforts of Muhammad Ali and Rifa'at Tahtawi to the Nahda of Georgi Zaidan and others, the meeting ground of the two currents is indeed a Nahda for the 21st century, a new renaissance for the Arab world, and through it, a broader renaissance for the Muslim world. Thus, Zaidan's legacy has a major relevance today. He was a Christian scholar of Islam, an Arab nationalist who saw the importance of the Islamic component of Arab culture and identity. He revived the understanding of the Muslim tradition while championing modernity, science, and westernization. He saw educating the wide public as primarily the elite's responsibility. He recognized the importance of an open exchange of ideas and practiced it by creating the best intellectual forum for such exchanges, Al-Hilal, the longest lived and still surviving cultural journal in Arabic. Ladies and gentlemen, we have celebrated the life of a man who with deceptive ease went from striving to success, from ambition to achievement, and from humble beginnings to the heights of recognition. Throughout the Arab world, he is remembered for his glorious contribution to the modernization of values and the values of modernization. A man of many facets, he was an artisan of the Nahda, the renaissance of the Arab world. He championed all the right causes, from the rationality of science to the romance of history, from the importance of knowing the cultural heritage of the past to the value of creating the cultural heritage of the future. Georgi Zaidan was a giant among his contemporaries, and successive generations of Arab readers rediscover him with joy. Such is the legacy he gave his people and the world. Thank you.